December 31st, 1931. The frozen wilderness of the Yukon Territory, where temperatures plunge to 40 below zero and darkness swallows the land for 20 hours a day. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable Edgar Millen lies dying in the snow, a bullet through his chest, while his killer vanishes into the white hell of the Arctic Circle like a phantom. His name was Albert Johnson, a man who spoke to no one, a trapper who set his lines on other men's territory, a hermit who built his cabin like a fortress and kept a pack of half-wild dogs that howled through the endless northern nights. For 48 days, he would lead the largest manhunt in Canadian Arctic history across 150 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. He would survive without supplies, outwit trained trackers, cross mountains that shouldn't be crossable in winter, and kill without hesitation or mercy. The RCMP would call him the Mad Trapper of Rat River. Newspapers would dub it the Arctic Circle War. Indigenous guides would whisper that he wasn't entirely human. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone imagined. Before we uncover the truth about Albert Johnson's 1932 Arctic killing spree, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to explore history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step into the frozen darkness of the Canadian North, where one man's rage would ignite the most expensive manhunt in RCMP history. The year is 1931, and the world is drowning in the Great Depression. In Canada's far north, the economic collapse hit different. The price of fur, beaver, mink, fox, marten had plummeted. Men who had carved out livings in the bush now found their pelts worth a fraction of what they'd been. Desperation hung in the air like the ice fog that rolled off the Mackenzie River. The Yukon Territory and Northwest Territories represented the last true frontier of North America. This wasn't the romantic wilderness of adventure novels. This was a land that killed casually and often. The Rat River region, where our story unfolds, sat just above the Arctic Circle, a maze of frozen waterways, stunted black spruce, and tundra that stretched endlessly in every direction. The few hundred souls scattered across this territory, white trappers, indigenous Gwich'in people, RCMP constables at remote posts, lived by unwritten codes. Respect other men's trap lines. Share what you have when someone's in need. Answer when spoken to. These weren't just courtesies. They were survival mechanisms in a place where your nearest neighbor might be 40 miles away and winter lasted 9 months. Into this world, in July 1931, came a man who would break every rule. He arrived in Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories, traveling by canoe down the Peel River. The RCMP constable who processed him noted he spoke with an accent, possibly Scandinavian, possibly something else. He gave his name as Albert Johnson, though he offered no papers, no history, nothing to verify his identity. This wasn't unusual. The North attracted men running from something. The constable recorded his appearance, 5'9", approximately 170 pounds, weathered face, piercing blue eyes that never quite met yours directly. Johnson purchased supplies at the trading post, flour, tea, ammunition, traps, and paid in cash. American bills, worn and crumpled, pulled from different pockets as though he didn't want anyone to see how much he carried. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and efficient. When asked where he planned to trap, he gestured vaguely north and west. Rat River country, he said. Nothing more. The locals watched him paddle away, his canoe sitting low in the water with his supplies. One of the indigenous guides later told authorities that Johnson's dogs, 3 large animals possibly, wolf-husky crosses, sat unnaturally still in the canoe, never making a sound. Like they'd been trained not to exist, the guide said. By August, Johnson had built his cabin on the banks of the Rat River, about 80 miles from the nearest settlement. Other trappers who passed by noted its peculiar construction. The walls were double thick, logs chinked with unusual care. The single small window faced away from the river toward the forest. No smoke came from the chimney during the day, only at night. And always those dogs sat silent on their chains, watching. William Douglas, a trapper whose lines ran near Johnson's territory, was the first to complain. In November 1931, he mushed into Fort McPherson to report that someone was tampering with his traps, springing them, sometimes taking the pelts, other times just destroying them. He'd tracked the saboteur to Johnson's cabin but received no answer when he called out. The dogs had stared at him through the darkness, but the man inside never responded. "There's something wrong with him," Douglas told Constable Alfred King. "You call out, you know he's in there, but he won't answer. Won't even tell you to go away, just silence, like he's waiting for you to try the door." Constable King knew the type, men who came north to disappear, who'd burned their bridges so thoroughly that human contact felt like a threat. Still, there were rules, even in the wilderness. You couldn't sabotage another man's living. What no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered until much later, was that Albert Johnson had been preparing for war from the moment he built that cabin. December 26, 1931, Boxing Day. While families across Canada gathered for holiday celebrations, Constable Alfred King and Special Constable Joe Bernard set out on a 9-hour dog sled journey to Albert Johnson's cabin. The temperature hovered at -45 Fahrenheit. The journey wasn't technically dangerous if you knew what you were doing. Both men had years of experience. But it was brutally unforgiving of mistakes. They arrived at Johnson's cabin as twilight descended, that peculiar Arctic gloaming that turned the world blue and shadowless. Smoke rose from the chimney. Through the small window they could see lamplight. Johnson's dogs watched them approach but made no sound. Not a growl, not a bark, just cold amber eyes tracking their movement. "Albert Johnson," King called out. "Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We need to speak with you about a complaint regarding trap lines." Silence. King and Bernard exchanged glances. This wasn't unprecedented. Some men needed time to adjust to authority after months of solitude. King tried again, explaining that they just wanted to talk, that Johnson wasn't in trouble, that they could sort this out quickly if he'd just come to the door. The lamplight inside moved. A shadow crossed the window. Someone was definitely home, definitely listening, but still no response. King approached closer, his breath freezing in clouds around his face. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to need you to open this door. We've traveled a long way, and we're not leaving until we speak with you." What happened next would be debated in the investigation that followed. King reached for the door handle. He later swore he didn't try to open it, just touched it to get Johnson's attention. But the instant his gloved hand made contact with the wood, a gunshot exploded from inside the cabin. The bullet punched through the door at chest height, exactly where King had been standing a fraction of a second before. The constable had shifted his weight at the last moment, and the round passed so close to his head that he felt its heat through his fur hat. Both officers dove for cover behind a woodpile as 2 more shots splintered through the door. Johnson was firing blind, but the shots were strategically placed, one high, one low, covering the likely positions anyone outside would take. "Johnson, stop firing. We just want to talk," King shouted from behind the logs. The response was another bullet that sent splinters flying from the woodpile. King and Bernard retreated to their dog sled. They weren't equipped for a siege, and the temperature was dropping. In the Arctic winter, cold could kill faster than bullets. They mushed back to Aklavik, the nearest post with radio communication, arriving 31 hours later with frostbite on their faces and a report that would set everything in motion. Inspector Alexander Eames, commander of the RCMP Arctic Division, faced a dilemma. Johnson had committed attempted murder of a police officer, but mounting an operation in the Arctic winter wasn't a simple matter of sending backup. Every man, every dog, every ounce of supplies had to be carefully calculated. The nearest reinforcements were hundreds of miles away. Radio communication was spotty at best, and if something went wrong, if men got stranded or injured, they would die. Still, the law was the law, even 150 miles above the Arctic Circle. On December 30th, a posse of 9 men set out for Johnson's cabin. Along with Eames and King, the party included 4 special constables, 2 indigenous guides, and Robert McDowell, the radio operator. They brought 42 dogs, multiple sleds loaded with supplies, and enough ammunition for a small war. They reached the cabin on December 31st, just as the year died. This time, they weren't taking chances. Eames positioned men around the cabin with rifles while he called out for Johnson to surrender. The temperature had dropped to -55. "Albert Johnson, this is Inspector Eames of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and you will not be harmed. You have 5 minutes to comply." They waited. The cabin remained dark and silent. After the 5 minutes elapsed, Eames gave the order. The constables threw dynamite at the cabin's foundation, trying to blast a hole in the wall. The explosion rocked the clearing, sent Johnson's dogs howling and straining at their chains, and blew a section of the lower logs apart. The posse rushed forward, expecting Johnson to be stunned or dead. Instead, gunfire erupted from inside. Johnson had survived the blast and taken up a firing position. He wasn't shooting wildly. Every shot was carefully aimed, forcing the officers to take cover. In the chaos, Special Constable Millen realized Johnson was firing from multiple positions inside the cabin, moving between shots to make it seem like there might be more than one person inside. "He's tactical," Millen said to Eames. "Military training, maybe. This isn't some bush hermit losing his mind." A 15-hour siege followed. The posse tried to rush the cabin twice more, but Johnson's defensive position was too strong. He'd built firing ports into the walls that gave him clear sight lines while remaining protected. He had enough ammunition to pin down 9 armed men, and as the Arctic night descended and the temperature continued to drop, it became clear who had the advantage. Eames made the call to retreat. 3 of his men had minor injuries from wood splinters and ricochets. They were burning through supplies. And Johnson showed no signs of weakening. The posse pulled back at dawn on January 1, 1932, leaving Johnson barricaded in his fortress cabin. But when they returned 2 days later with more men and more dynamite, they found the cabin abandoned. Johnson had slipped away during the night, on foot, in weather that should have killed him within hours. His dogs were gone. So were his weapons and a minimal amount of supplies. He'd left behind most of his food, his furs, everything that had weight. Tracking him should have been simple. Fresh snow had fallen, and one man on snowshoes leaves obvious traces. But Johnson had done something that defied logic. He'd walked backward in his own tracks, then jumped to hard-packed snow, then waded through a partially frozen creek. He'd used technique that indigenous trackers called ghost walking, methods that took years to master and required intimate knowledge of winter survival. "He's not running scared," said Moses, one of the Gwich'in guides. "He's hunting. We're not chasing him anymore. He's choosing where this goes." The guide's words proved prophetic in the most terrible way possible. If this story is giving you chills, smash that like button. The manhunt is about to turn even darker. Share this with someone who loves true crime mysteries they've never heard before, and stick around. What happens next shocked an entire nation. January 30th, 1932. Day 40 of the manhunt. The temperature had climbed to a relatively warm -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Inspector Eames had assembled the largest posse in Canadian Arctic history. 9 RCMP officers, 7 indigenous trackers, 42 dogs, and Wap May, a bush pilot who had just arrived with a Belanca aircraft equipped with skis. The airplane was a gamble. Aviation in the Arctic winter was barely tested technology, and one mechanical failure meant death. But Johnson had already crossed 50 miles of terrain that shouldn't have been passable on foot. The tracking party had followed Johnson up the Rat River, where he'd somehow climbed the Richardson Mountains in a blizzard, descended into the Bell River drainage, then doubled back across his own trail multiple times. He was setting false paths, hiding his tracks, surviving without fire or shelter in conditions that were killing the dogs on the posse's sleds. Supply caches they'd established kept getting raided. Always enough taken to survive, never enough to make the theft obvious until it was too late. "He's playing with us," Constable King said. "Every time we think we have him cornered, he's already 3 moves ahead." The tracking party had split into 2 groups, trying to cover more territory. One group, led by Special Constable Edgar Millen, was following what looked like fresh tracks along a creek bed near the Eagle River. Millen was considered the best tactical officer in the Arctic Division. Decorated service, expert marksman, experienced in dealing with dangerous fugitives. Around 2:00 p.m., as the winter sun hung low and weak on the horizon, Millen spotted movement ahead. A figure crouched behind a fallen log on the opposite bank of the frozen creek. The figure raised a rifle. Millen dove for cover, but he'd been caught in the open. Johnson's first shot hit him in the chest, knocking him backward into the snow. The second shot would have killed him instantly. But Constable King returned fire, forcing Johnson to retreat into the tree line. The other constables rushed to Millen. The bullet had pierced his left chest, likely puncturing his lung. Blood bubbled from his mouth with each breath, a sucking chest wound. They had no medical supplies adequate for this kind of injury, no way to get him to a hospital in time. The nearest doctor was in Aklavik. At least 2 days by dogs sled through the mountains. Edgar Millen died in the snow at 4:30 p.m., surrounded by his fellow officers, drowning in his own blood while Albert Johnson disappeared into the wilderness like smoke. The killing changed everything. Up until that moment, Johnson had been a fugitive. Dangerous, yes, but the manhunt had maintained certain boundaries. Now he was a cop killer. The full resources of the Canadian government mobilized. The Prime Minister himself authorized unlimited funding. Newspapers across North America picked up the story. Radio broadcasts tracked the manhunt's progress. Johnson's face, or rather a rough sketch based on descriptions, since no photograph existed, appeared on wanted posters from Vancouver to Toronto. What authorities discovered in Johnson's abandoned campsites painted a disturbing picture of his capabilities. At one site, they found evidence he'd caught, butchered, and eaten a ptarmigan raw. At another, footprints showed he'd dug a snow cave barely large enough for his body, a survival shelter that would keep you from freezing but only if you could tolerate a space so cramped you couldn't move. He'd used willow bark to craft snowshoe repairs. He'd collected frozen spruce sap to patch his clothing. Most unsettling were the patterns his tracks made. Multiple times, the trackers found places where Johnson had stopped, circled back on his own trail, and apparently waited, watching his pursuers from concealment, studying their tactics, counting their numbers. At one ambush point, he'd built a sniper's nest with firing lanes covering 3 different approach routes. "He's not trying to escape anymore," Inspector Eames told the assembled posse. "He's trying to kill as many of us as possible before we take him down. From this point forward, we treat him as a military target." The psychological toll on the pursuing officers was immense. They were hunting a man who should have been dead a dozen times over. From exposure, from starvation, from the sheer physical impossibility of what he was doing. Some of the indigenous guides began refusing to track at night, saying Johnson moved through the darkness, like something that didn't need light to see. One constable, who would later require psychological treatment, described approaching what they thought was Johnson's campsite. There were these wolf tracks all around, but they weren't quite right. The stride was too long, the depth too even, and then we realized they were Johnson's tracks. He'd somehow altered his gait to mimic a wolf. He was trying to make us think wild animals were in the area, to spook the dogs, to make us nervous. What kind of man learns to walk like a wolf? On February 14, 1932, Valentine's Day, pilot Wap May spotted a figure moving across a frozen river valley from his aircraft. The man looked up at the plane, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet punched through the aircraft's wing, missing the fuel tank by inches. The final confrontation was coming, and everyone knew it. February 17, 1932, the Eagle River, Northwest Territories. Wap May's aircraft had tracked Johnson to a narrow section of River Valley, where the steep walls limited escape routes. The pilot had pioneered a new tactic, flying low enough to spot Johnson, then circling back to guide the ground forces to his location via prearranged signals. It was dangerous flying, but it worked. Inspector Eames assembled his entire posse for what he believed would be the final confrontation. 17 armed men on dog sleds converged on the river valley, where Johnson had made his last stand. This time, there would be no cabin walls to hide behind, no darkness to vanish into. They found him on a bend in the river, crouched behind a packed snow berm he'd constructed during the night. Even in his final hours, Johnson had been preparing defensive positions. His tracks showed he'd been awake all night, building and rebuilding his snow fort to create interlocking fields of fire. "Albert Johnson," Eames called out across the frozen river. "There's nowhere left to run. Surrender and you will receive medical treatment and fair trial." Johnson's response came in the form of a rifle shot that whistled past Eames's head. The firefight that followed lasted for 2 hours. Johnson had positioned himself brilliantly. The river bend gave him clear sightlines in 3 directions, and the snow berm absorbed bullets like sandbags. He rationed his ammunition carefully, taking single shots only when he had clear targets, making the officers believe he might have more supplies than he actually did. Wap May circled overhead in his Balanca, radioing the posse's positions and trying to spot weaknesses in Johnson's position. At one point, the pilot actually dropped a package of dynamite near Johnson's snow fort, but the explosives landed too far away to be effective. Constable Hersey, approaching from the left flank, managed to get within 30 yards before Johnson spotted him and fired. The bullet grazed Hersey's knee, sending him sprawling. As other officers provided covering fire, Hersey crawled to safety behind an ice pressure ridge. "He's still got at least a dozen rounds," Hersey gasped, "and his shooting's as accurate as it was on day 1. How is that possible? He should be half dead from exposure and starvation." The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. Staff Sergeant Hersey, a different Hersey than the wounded constable, had worked his way along the riverbank to a position slightly elevated above Johnson's snow fort. From there, he had an angle that bypassed Johnson's primary defensive coverage. At 1:45 p.m., Hersey took the shot that ended the manhunt. The .30-30 round struck Johnson in the lower back, angling upward through his torso. Johnson staggered, tried to bring his rifle to bear on this new threat, but his legs gave out. He collapsed into the snow, still clutching his weapon. The officers approached cautiously. Even wounded, Johnson was considered deadly. But as they reached the snow fort, they could see he was dying. The bullet had destroyed his liver and possibly his spine. Blood pooled beneath him, steaming in the Arctic air. "Who are you?" Inspector Eames asked, kneeling beside the dying man. "What's your real name?" Johnson looked at him with Dach. Those pale blue eyes, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His lips moved, forming words that none of the officers present could quite agree on afterward. Some said he smiled. Others said he tried to raise his rifle one last time. Staff Sergeant Hersey would later testify that Johnson's final words were, "I did what I had to do." Albert Johnson died at 1:57 p.m. on February 17, 1932, 49 days after the manhunt began. What they found in his final campsite was both revealing and deeply troubling. Johnson carried $24.10 in cash, a fortune during the Depression, in various denominations, including American, Canadian, and some Scandinavian currency. He had a Winchester rifle with nearly 200 rounds of ammunition, much of it hand-loaded, suggesting he'd been preparing for extended combat. His clothing was meticulous, multiple layers, each one carefully maintained and repaired using techniques that indicated military or survival training. But there was no identification, no letters, no photographs, no documents of any kind. The man who'd been called Albert Johnson had erased his past so thoroughly that not a single personal item remained. His body was transported back to Aklavik, where an autopsy revealed more mysteries. The coroner noted unusual scarring on Johnson's torso, old gunshot wounds, and what appeared to be shrapnel marks. His hands showed calluses consistent with heavy labor, but also evidence of frostbite damage from years before this manhunt. His teeth had gold fillings done in a style uncommon in North America. This man was a professional something, the coroner wrote in his report. Military, perhaps, or criminal, but definitely someone who'd lived a violent life long before coming to Canada. The RCMP launched an extensive investigation to identify Johnson. They sent his fingerprints, dental records, and photograph to police agencies across North America and Europe. The response was frustrating. Several agencies said Johnson looked familiar, that the fingerprints might match suspects from various cases, but nothing concrete ever emerged. In the United States, the FBI suggested Johnson might be Arthur Nelson, a suspect in a 1927 murder in North Dakota. In Norway, authorities wondered if he could be a missing merchant sailor named Sigvald Petersen Hoskjold, who disappeared in 1927 after being linked to a smuggling operation. Australian police thought he resembled a man wanted for armed robbery in Sydney in 1922, but none of these leads panned out. DNA testing wouldn't be available for decades, and even the best investigative techniques of the 1930s couldn't crack the mystery. The legal aftermath was surprisingly complex. Technically, Johnson had never committed a crime beyond trapping violations before he shot at Constable King. The escalation had been, in some ways, a series of mutual choices: police pursuit leading to siege, leading to manhunt, leading to killing. Some newspapers questioned whether the RCMP had handled the initial contact properly. A few editorial writers suggested that if King hadn't approached Johnson's door, the entire tragedy might have been avoided. These criticisms infuriated the RCMP and the families of the officers involved. Inspector Eames gave a single interview to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in which he stated, "Albert Johnson was a man who came north with one purpose: to disappear or die fighting. We gave him every opportunity to surrender peacefully. He chose violence at every turn. Constable Millen's death is on Johnson's hands and his alone." The manhunt cost the Canadian government over $100,000, equivalent to roughly $2 million today. 5 officers sustained injuries requiring hospitalization. 17 dogs died from exposure or exhaustion. The psychological toll on the surviving officers was significant. 3 requested transfers to southern postings, and at least 1 required treatment for what would now be called PTSD. Johnson was buried in an unmarked GER of in the Aklavik cemetery. The RCMP refused to disclose its exact location, fearing it would become a macabre tourist attraction, or, worse, a shrine for anti-government extremists who'd begun romanticizing Johnson as some kind of frontier rebel. In the decades that followed, various theories about Johnson's identity emerged. Some researchers suggested he'd been a shell-shocked World War I veteran, driven mad by his experiences in the trenches. Others proposed he'd been a fugitive from the Chicago mob wars, hiding in the last place anyone would look. A few persistent investigators believed he'd been a Soviet agent, sent to map Canadian Arctic defenses during the period of paranoia between the world wars. In 2007, forensic scientists exhumed Johnson's body for DNA analysis and isotope testing. The results were inconclusive but intriguing. Isotope analysis of his bones and teeth suggested he'd spent his early life in the American Midwest or Scandinavia, had moved frequently during his teens and 20s, and had been in the Canadian Arctic for less than 2 years before his death. DNA analysis couldn't match him to any known relatives, but it did rule out several of the historical suspects. As of 2024, Albert Johnson's true identity remains unknown. He is one of the few people in modern history to successfully take his real name to the grave. The Mad Trapper manhunt fundamentally changed how Canadian law enforcement operated in remote regions. The RCMP instituted new protocols for confronting armed suspects in isolated areas, mandating larger initial response teams and better communication equipment. They established emergency supply caches at strategic points throughout the Arctic, recognizing that officers could no longer be expected to handle extended operations without significant logistical support. The use of aircraft in the manhunt pioneered what would become standard practice. WAPME's successful tracking of Johnson demonstrated that aviation could revolutionize northern policing. Within 2 years, the RCMP had acquired multiple aircraft specifically for Arctic patrol work. By the 1940s, bush planes were an integral part of northern law enforcement, search and rescue, and medical evacuation. The manhunt also exposed deep tensions between traditional indigenous knowledge and modern police methodology. Throughout the pursuit, the Gwich'in guides had provided tracking expertise that none of the white officers possessed. They'd read the landscape, predicted Johnson's movements, and taught survival techniques that kept the posse alive in brutal conditions. Yet in the official reports and newspaper coverage, their contributions were largely minimized or ignored entirely. This pattern of indigenous expertise being simultaneously relied upon and marginalized would continue for decades in Canadian Arctic operations. It wasn't until the 1990s that the RCMP formally acknowledged the debt owed to the indigenous trackers who'd made the manhunt possible, issuing commemorative citations to their descendants. The manhunt's psychological impact rippled through remote communities across Canada. If someone as seemingly ordinary as Albert Johnson could transform into a killing machine, how could anyone trust their isolated neighbors? Paranoia increased. Trappers began checking on each other more frequently, not out of friendliness but from fear. The unwritten codes of northern life grew more rigid, with communities becoming less tolerant of outsiders who didn't integrate properly. Several similar cases emerged in the years following Johnson's death, though none reached the same level of violence or duration. In 1935, a trapper in northern Saskatchewan barricaded himself in his cabin after a dispute with authorities, leading to a 3-week standoff. In 1941, a prospector in the Yukon shot at RCMP officers serving a warrant, triggering a manhunt that lasted 11 days. In each case, investigators noted that the suspects seemed to be following a template established by the Mad Trapper: fortified positions, survival in extreme conditions, calculated violence. Psychologists and criminologists who've studied the Johnson case have used it to develop profiles of what they call wilderness psychopaths, individuals with military or survival training who deliberately isolate themselves in remote regions and respond to any intrusion with extreme violence. The profile includes characteristics like meticulous preparation, lack of social connections, hoarding of supplies, and an almost obsessive focus on self-reliance taken to pathological extremes. The case also influenced popular culture in ways both obvious and subtle. In the 1980s, a fictionalized film called Death Hunt, starring Charles Bronson and Lee Marvin, took loose inspiration from the manhunt, though it changed virtually every significant detail and turned Johnson into a wrongly accused hero. The real story, a hermit who murdered a police officer during a routine investigation, was apparently too dark even for Hollywood. More recently, true crime podcasts and documentaries have revisited the case, often framing it as a mystery about identity rather than a straightforward manhunt. These productions emphasize the unknown aspects. Who was Albert Johnson? Where did he learn his survival skills? Why did he come to the Arctic? While sometimes glossing over the violence he inflicted. This romanticization troubles some historians and law enforcement professionals. "We can't forget that Edgar Millen left behind a wife and 2 young children," said Dr. Sarah Chen, a criminologist who studied the case extensively. The mystery of Johnson's identity is interesting, but it shouldn't overshadow the fact that he was a murderer who chose violence when he could have chosen cooperation. The Millen family's suffering didn't end with Edgar's death. His widow, Edith, struggled financially during the Depression, as the RCMP's pension for fallen officers was minimal. The Millen children grew up with the burden of their father's fame. He'd become a folk hero in some circles, the brave constable killed by the mad trapper. But this celebrity didn't translate into material support. Edgar Millen Jr., interviewed in 1987 shortly before his death, spoke bitterly about the romanticization of Johnson. People write about him like he was some kind of frontier Houdini. They forget he put a bullet through my father's chest and left him to die in the snow. From a law enforcement perspective, the Manhunt demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of 1930s police work. The RCMP successfully tracked and ultimately neutralized an extremely dangerous fugitive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. They adapted tactics on the fly, incorporated new technology, and coordinated a complex operation across vast distances with limited communication. But they also made mistakes. The initial confrontation at Johnson's cabin was poorly planned. The decision to use dynamite in the siege escalated tensions rather than resolving them. The posse's early pursuit strategies were sometimes predictable, allowing Johnson to set ambushes. These tactical failures became part of RCMP training curricula, teaching future generations of officers what not to do in similar situations. Modern cold case investigators continue to work on identifying Johnson. In 2019, a team of genealogical researchers used DNA phenotyping to create an updated image of what Johnson likely looked like, hoping it might trigger recognition from someone researching their family history. The image was shared across ancestry websites and historical societies, generating hundreds of tips, but none have yet led to a confirmed identity. The most persistent theory among contemporary researchers is that Johnson was a bank robber or burglar who'd fled to the Arctic with stolen money. This would explain the large amount of cash he carried, his paranoid behavior, and his combat-ready mindset. Sev. Unsolved bank robberies from the 1920s in the American Midwest involved suspects who disappeared completely after the crimes, and Johnson's timeline and location would fit this profile. But until definitive evidence emerges, a DNA match, a discovered document, a deathbed confession from an accomplice, Albert Johnson's true identity remains one of the most enduring mysteries in Canadian criminal history. What we do know is this: he was a man so determined to disappear that he erased himself completely, and when civilization found him anyway, in the form of 2 police officers at his cabin door, he chose war over surrender. The 49-day manhunt that followed revealed something uncomfortable about human nature, that some people, when pushed to extremes, become almost superhuman in their capacity for violence and survival. The frozen north that killed so many others seemed to sustain Johnson, as though he'd found his natural environment. In the end, it took 17 armed men, an airplane, and 2 months of pursuit to stop him. And even in death, he won a kind of victory. His secrets died with him in the snow. What do you think drove Albert Johnson to such extreme violence? Was he a traumatized veteran, a career criminal,